Okay, this is section 4-2 in the book, and it is called Making ATP Without Oxygen.
You should put the mic on, because when I watched that video, every time you walked away, I was like leaning into my computer.
I'm sorry, you're right, I should. Okay, how's this? Without oxygen. All right. Now, folks, last time and up to this point, we've been focusing on ATP itself and how it releases energy, right? We haven't talked yet about how ATP is produced. Remember, to make ATP out of ADP requires energy. So where does a cell get that energy? Where does that energy come from? All right? And here's how it works. Sorry. Okay. It all starts with glucose. So I'm going to start with kind of an overview here, and I don't think the book really does it like this, but that's okay. It all starts with glucose, which of course is C6H12O6. It's a form of sugar. It's blood sugar. Okay, it's what our cells use. It's what plants produce from photosynthesis. Now, what happens to glucose is it first goes through a process called glycolysis. Glycolysis. Now, the word lysis means splitting, and so it's just glucose splitting, all right? And that's what it's going to do. We're going to show you in a little bit more detail. It basically splits the glucose into two parts. So, glucose splitting. So, glycolysis is when the glucose gets split into two parts. Now, once glycolysis happens, there's two options. If there's oxygen present, if oxygen is present. So this is just kind of a flow chart here that we're making. If oxygen is present, and by the way, your book does not have this, so you're going to want to have this picture in your notes. If oxygen is present, then the next step is cellular respiration, which we're going to go into later this week and next week. It's more complicated, but it's what happens in the mitochondria, cellular respiration. If there is no oxygen present, then there's two options. All right? We've got two options. We have lactic acid fermentation. I mentioned this briefly last time. This actually happens in the human body when there's not enough oxygen. So like you're running sprints, for example, and toward the end of the sprint, or say toward the end of the 400 meters, your thighs really start to burn. What's happening is your muscles aren't getting enough oxygen, so they're producing ATP through lactic acid fermentation, and the lactic acid is causing that burning sensation. All right? So lactic acid fermentation, this happens in the human body. Your body does not do the other option, okay? There's another type of fermentation, and this is called ethanol or alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation, and this is done by yeast. Okay, so yeast do this. And you guys have already seen yeast in action, and we've done a couple labs with yeast, or at least one. But this is the basic idea of alcoholic fermentation. Now, we're going to go through each of these. We're going to start with glycolysis, all right? So let's start with glycolysis. Okay, to start with a summary. Glycolysis is the breaking down of glucose, It occurs outside of, now this is important, folks, it occurs outside of the mitochondria. Now, this is the first time in a while that I've mentioned mitochondria, but they are going to be heavily involved here when we talk about respiration. Respiration happens inside the mitochondria, but this step happens outside. In other words, it happens right out in the general cytoplasm, outside of the mitochondria. It makes two things. It makes ATP, well, it makes other things too, but the most important are it makes ADP from ADP. And you guys should know all about ADP and ATP at this point. It makes a triphosphate from adenosine diphosphate. It makes the 3 phosphates from the 2, right? It puts one of the phosphates onto the molecule. And it makes NADH. Now, this is a brand new compound that you're going to need to know about. NADH is an electron carrier. An electron carrier. NADH, okay? It also makes, now right now we don't really care about NADH because we don't know what it is, but it's going to be important in respiration, so just kind of put it aside right now. We've heard about it. We're going to see it more in the next step, all right? But this also makes 2 other compounds. It makes pyruvic acid, which also goes into respiration, and carbon dioxide, CO2. And lastly, and this is kind of where really the rubber meets the road on this thing, it releases or produces about 10% of the energy that was stored in the glucose. I'm just going to say it like this. I'm going to say the energy available from the glucose. Only 10%. The rest of the energy that's available from the glucose is going to be released by respiration. This step releases only 10% of what can be released. So we're not done with the glucose. We split it into 2 parts. We get a little bit of ATP, but those 2 parts can be broken down. And that's what's going to happen in respiration. All right? So that is a summary of it. Now let's look at it in a little more detail. I found this nice picture on, this is actually on, this is on Wikipedia. You are not going to draw this, but I just want to lead you through the steps here. There's also a little diagram in your book. This is from Wikipedia. So look at glucose. See that? This is really a great figure because it's a cool figure of glucose. You guys have seen glucose before. You made a model of it, some of you. Glucose is up there on the left. Now, does anybody remember what the ASE ending means on a name of a chemical? Good guess. ASE, let me give you some examples. Amylase. It is no, you're getting closer. It is an enzyme, okay? So what this is showing me here is an enzyme is helping this to happen. But look at this picture right here. I've got ATP going to ADP, right? Okay, so what do we get out of this? Now, by the way, in your book here, if you look on page 79 in your book, you're going to see a simplified version of this. So page 79 in your book has a simplified version of this. But look what happens here. This is kind of interesting because when we think about ATP, what you guys did in your posters and stuff, you showed the phosphate joining with water, right? It doesn't have to join with water. The key is that little phosphate that comes off joins with something. And whatever it joins with, bang, it gives off energy. Now look what's happening in this one. It actually joined with the glucose. So that phosphate came off of there. It went from ATP to ADP, and look where it is now. It bonded with that oxygen on the glucose. And this is not uncommon. So that phosphate actually snaps to different things in different circumstances. Sometimes it might even snap onto an enzyme and
make that enzyme work. Yes?
So when it bonds with water, it becomes ADP.
The phosphate bonds with the OH from the water. And then the ATP is now ADP because it lost a phosphate. A diphosphate instead of triphosphate. So it lost one. Now there's another enzyme that comes into play here, and we get a little bit different molecule. And then look at this. Another ATP gets used up to put another phosphate on. See this? Now there's two phosphates stuck to the glucose. This is essentially a glucose molecule with now two phosphates stuck to it. And we've gotten energy twice out of this. I mean, actually, we've used energy to do this. Okay? Don't worry about those names. Okay? You don't have to know all these names. Phosphofructokinase. That is an enzyme. Now, the next step, folks. Hey, by the way, at this point in the process, we have actually. Oh, see, I was wrong about that. Look at what we've done. We've actually used energy to do this. So that means we've actually used energy to do this. See, it's ATP going to ADP. So that gave off energy. We've used it. So we haven't made the ATP yet, right? So as we go down here, now there's the split. All right? And this gets broken into two pieces. Basically, you just cut that molecule right in half. And this is shown in your book on this page 79. It just kind of simplifies the molecules. The 6-carbon molecule gets broken into 2 3-carbon molecules. Then we go from those two. Now's when we make the NADH. And finally, oh no, we're still using up ATP here. We're putting another phosphate on there. Where do we make the ATP? This is kind of complicated, huh? Aren't you glad you don't have to memorize all these steps? There we go. We're finally making some ATP when we convert this phosphoenol pyruvate into pyruvate. And this thing is going to make, the end result of this is going to be, it's going to make 4 ATPs, but because it used 2 in the beginning, it has a net production of 2 ATP molecules. All right. So again, this is just to show you the whole picture of what's going on. What do you need to know? Right here. So let me write this down. This is, look on the figure 4.5 on page 79. All right? And these are the main points, by the way, that I'm interested in you knowing right there. So look at figure 4-5, but these are the main points that I want you to know. What it makes, what's the end result. Basically, it splits glucose in half. And in the whole process, it's got a lot of steps, but the end result is you get a couple of ATP molecules out of it. All right? So you harvest a little bit of the energy from the glucose, but you're not done. Now let's look at lactic acid fermentation. So we just looked at glycolysis, now lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation starts with glucose. So I'm going to show you the chemical formula here. It starts with C6H12O6. That's glucose. Now, notice it doesn't need oxygen. So it's just that glucose molecule. And this thing, of course, neither did glycolysis. That didn't need oxygen either. This thing is going to split into 2 lactic acid molecules, which look like this. C3, H6O3. And that makes sense, right? Because you cut these in half, right? 6, 12, 6, 3, 6, 3. See that? And that thing is lactic acid. And like I said, this stuff actually builds up in your muscles when you're working out. If you're not able to take in oxygen fast enough with your breathing and get it to your muscles fast enough, then this stuff starts to build up and you start to have pain. And sometimes the pain can get fairly severe if you're really over the top in terms of the amount of lactic acid you're producing. But see, I mean, it's not like this is a bad thing. I mean, your cells are doing this. Why are they doing it? Because they're trying to keep producing energy even though they're not able to get enough oxygen. So it's kind of cool that they have the ability to do that. So even when they can't get oxygen fast enough, they can still work. Right? So it's an important function. But it has this drawback that it gets painful. So that's lactic acid fermentation. And of course, this is going to produce ATP. And so what we can do, I'm going to use this little notation because I kind of like on that figure the way they do this. You can show it like this, that this process is powered, is not powered, but it's also producing ATP from ADP. All right? And I guess maybe we could also show it like this. Maybe I should have just shown it like this. And I'm not sure how many there are. I'd have to look more closely at it. I don't know how many ATP molecules it produces. Notice it's going to require, I mean, what it's doing basically is it's getting the energy used to make the ATP. Because remember, to go from ADP to ATP requires energy. That energy is coming from the changes in bonds from this guy here when it gets broken down. So that produces ATP. And then finally, and then we'll be done with the lecture after this, we have alcoholic fermentation. Your cells do not do this, folks. You don't get intoxicated as you're running around the track, right? Your cells don't do this. This is accomplished by yeast, right? And here's the formula. C6H12O6 produces C2H5OH, which is ethanol, and CO2 gas. Now you've seen this reaction before, and what we did, we did a yeast lab earlier in the class, in the semester, and we saw bubbles of CO2 and we measured them in the cylinder. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
The cylinders, we had yeast in there and sugar, we saw the bubbles go up. Now, you may not have known it at the time, but those were also producing ethanol at the same time. They do when you bake bread too. When you bake bread and the bread rises because the CO2 is being produced, it's also producing ethanol, but you burn it off when you bake the bread. All right? You evaporate it off. So this is ethanol and carbon dioxide. And of course, this is also going to produce ATP. So we have ADP, and it's going to make ATP. And then the ATP, remember, is like an energy source. So that can be used in different places in the cell to produce energy. All right? But this is the heart of this reaction. So basically, you got sugar, you got yeast. The yeast are going to make ethanol and carbon dioxide.
What does the CO2 say?
Carbon dioxide, sorry, it's kind of sloppy. Yeah, carbon dioxide. Okay, so what's going on here, though, if we think about in terms of bonds, remember there was energy required to make this guy. To make this out of this requires energy. To make ATP from ADP, you need energy. Where'd you get it? It's from the changes in the bonds in these things. You're breaking bonds over here, but you're forming different bonds over here. And so that process is releasing some energy that is used to make the ATP out of the ADP. You're always making bonds and breaking bonds, right? And whichever involves more energy, that's That determines whether you're going to be releasing energy or requiring energy for the whole reaction. Let's see, is there anything else I want to say about alcoholic fermentation? All right, that's it.